In the heart of Hampshire lies the seemingly tranquil town of Market Basing. It's the kind of place where the chiming of church bells marks the hours, where life unfolds at a pace as measured as the ticking of an old grandfather clock. Yet, beneath the picturesque veneer of cobblestone streets and ivy-covered cottages lies a quiet unease, as though the very stones whisper secrets in the still of the night. It was on one such quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, that the first crack appeared in Market Basing's perfect facade. A figure, silhouetted against the orange-pink glow of twilight, slipped out of sight near the imposing Hardman bank. Moments later, the iron shutters clanged shut with an unusual finality, the sound echoing through the empty street like a warning bell. By morning the news spread like wildfire. Marcus Hardman, the town's wealthiest and most influential resident, had vanished without a trace. Marcus Hardman was no ordinary man. A banker with deep pockets and deeper connections, he was known for his air of sophistication, his polished manners, and his ability to broker deals that left others in awe. But as whispers circulated through the town, another portrait of Hardman began to emerge of a man who had made as many enemies as he had friends. "It's always the rich ones," muttered the townsfolk, huddled at the market square, their voices hushed but their curiosity loud. Enter Hercule Poirot. The famed Belgian detective arrived in Market Basing that very afternoon, stepping off the train with his impeccable attire and an air of calm authority. His arrival turned heads and raised eyebrows. What could bring a man of such renown to their little corner of the world? As Poirot surveyed the streets with a keen eye, his companion Captain Hastings tried to downplay the mystery. A missing banker in a sleepy town? Hardly a case for you, Poirot, Hastings remarked, glancing around. Ah, Hastings, Poirot replied with a knowing smile. Do not underestimate a small town. It is here, in such places, that the most curious puzzles are hidden beneath the surface. And this one, I already feel it is no ordinary case. Poirot's words seemed prophetic. By nightfall, more questions had surfaced. Hardman's office was found locked from the inside, his desk undisturbed, but missing a crucial set of keys. A half-written letter lay abandoned on his desk, its cryptic words trailing off mid-sentence. Even stranger, a faint, unfamiliar scent lingered in the room, something sharp, almost metallic. And then there was the question of the silhouette. Several townsfolk claimed to have seen someone lurking near Hardman's office the night before his disappearance. It wasn't him. An old cobbler swore, too tall, too thin. Who was this mysterious figure? And what, if anything, did they have to do with Hardman's sudden and baffling absence? As Poirot prepared to dive into the mystery, a chill seemed to settle over Market Basing, as though the town itself was holding its breath. Somewhere in the labyrinth of secrets and lies, an answer awaited. But as Poirot would soon discover, the truth was far darker and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Monsieur Hastings, Poirot murmured that night, gazing out of his window at the sleeping town, I fear this is only the beginning. Cliffhanger. As the quiet night deepened, a blood-curdling scream tore through the stillness of Market Basing. Poirot froze, his sharp eyes narrowing. What was that? Hastings stammered, rushing to the window. Poirot's voice dropped to a grave whisper. A warning, Hastings, and I fear the game has only just begun. Market Basing was the kind of town that seemed plucked from the pages of a postcard, its cobblestone streets twisted through rows of charming cottages, their chimneys puffing lazy wisps of smoke. The market square, with its flower stalls and cheerful chatter, was a hub of activity where everyone greeted each other by name. To any outsider, it was a slice of idyllic English life, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But beneath its polished charm, Market Basing held a secret. It was the kind of place where people noticed everything and said very little. Whispers traveled faster than the wind, yet the town's smiles never faltered. It wasn't just a quaint village, it was a stage where everyone played their part. And when one of its most prominent players vanished, the entire performance teetered on the edge of collapse. Marcus Hardman, the man at the center of it all, was more than just a banker. He was the heartbeat of Market Basing's economy, a figure of power who could make or break fortunes with a single decision. His grand Georgian home, perched on the hill overlooking the town, was both a symbol of his wealth and a fortress of his influence. To the townsfolk, he was untouchable until the morning he disappeared. The first clue came when the shutters of Hardman Bank remained closed far beyond their usual hour. By midday, rumors were flying. Perhaps he's fallen ill, suggested Mrs. Taylor, the grocer's wife. Or gone to London on urgent business, another chimed in. But as the day wore on, the unsettling truth began to creep in. Hardman was nowhere to be found. His housekeeper reported that his bed hadn't been slept in, his office was locked tight, and his beloved car sat untouched in the driveway. The idyllic rhythm of the town faltered. People gathered in small groups, their hushed conversations filled with speculation. What could have happened to Marcus Hardman? A man of such stature didn't simply vanish not without leaving behind a trail. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the cobblestones, an eerie quiet settled over Market Basing. The laughter in the pubs was muted, the market stalls packed up earlier than usual, and in the flickering lamplight outside Hardman's bank, a lone figure stood watching motionless, shrouded in darkness. Some say they saw the figure slip into the night, others claim it vanished altogether. But one thing was clear. Marcus Hardman wasn't the only secret Market Basing was hiding. And as the town slept uneasily, one question loomed over the silence. If Hardman was gone, who might be next? As the train slowed to a stop at the Market Basing station, the stillness of the town seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy. The quaint little platform was empty save for a few lingering fog tendrils curling around the lampposts, as though the town itself was waiting watching. Hercule Poirot stepped off the train first, his polished shoes clicking on the weathered wood of the platform. His gaze swept over the town with the precision of a hawk, noting every detail, the way the streets curved around the edges of the town square, the way the tall spires of the church loomed over the cottages, and the faintest rustling of curtains in windows above. Beside him, Captain Hastings squinted at the scene with something resembling mild disinterest. "It's a rather picturesque little place, isn't it?" he remarked, adjusting his hat. "I can't imagine why anyone would want to stir up trouble here." Poirot gave him a pointed look, his brows arching slightly. "Ah, Hastings, you underestimate the value of a small town. It is in such places, with their perfect facades, that the most intriguing mysteries often hide." Hastings laughed, clearly unconvinced. "Really, Poirot? This is the kind of town where everyone knows everyone else. Nothing exciting happens here. I'd say we'll be lucky to find a decent cup of tea." But Poirot was already a step ahead. His eyes had narrowed as he observed the townsfolk, those who hurried past with their heads down, and others who watched from behind half-drawn curtains with looks of mild curiosity. The peace here, he could tell, was but a fragile veneer. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said, with a slight twinkle in his eye. "Let us see what secrets Market Basing holds beneath its charming exterior." As they made their way down the cobbled streets, the silence deepened. The town was more quiet than even Hastings had imagined. It felt as if the walls were listening, and the air was thick with something unsaid. The grand Hardman estate loomed ahead, its windows darkened, and its once pristine front yard overgrown with neglect. The silence surrounding the mansion was too profound for a house that should have been brimming with servants and life. The only sound was the distant caw of a crow perched on the weather-worn fence, casting a long shadow over the path. "Hardman's house, I presume?" Hastings asked, pointing toward the grand but eerily quiet residence. "I suppose it's safe to assume we're not here for a garden party?" Poirot's lips curled into a thin smile. "Indeed, Hastings, the invitation has not yet arrived, but what we have here is a mysteryone of considerable consequence." They were not alone. Across the street, a figure stood in the doorway of a small, nondescript shop, watching them intently. As they passed, the figure's eyes followed them sharp, calculating but hidden beneath a veil of indifference. It was the first sign of suspicion, and Poirot's instincts told him it wouldn't be the last. By the time they reached the gates of Hardman's estate, a curious feeling had settled in the pit of Poirot's stomach, a feeling that something or someone was very much watching them. As they stood at the edge of the grand lawn, Poirot's gaze lingered on the mansion's dark windows. He could almost feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing on him, the tension of secrets lurking within the walls. "I don't know, Poirot," Hastings muttered, tugging at his collar. "This place gives me the creeps. Maybe we should leave it to the local authorities." Poirot didn't respond. His sharp eyes scanned the dark windows once more, then drifted to the shadowed corners of the garden. And just as they turned to leave, a faint sound caught Poirot's attention, a creak of a door. "Did you hear that, Hastings?" Poirot whispered, his voice low. Hastings froze, looking around, but saw nothing. "I didn't hear anything. Are you sure?" Poirot stepped forward, his steps deliberate and quiet. "It was not your imagination, Hastings. And that is only the beginning." The door creaked again, louder this time, as if answering Poirot's call. The mystery began to unravel early one Monday morning when Marcus Hardman failed to show up for an important meeting at his office. It wasn't like him. Hardman was known for his punctuality, his precision, and his almost obsessive need for control. At first, his secretary assumed he had been delayed. Perhaps a personal matter, perhaps something trivial, but as the hours ticked by, worry turned to alarm. When a clerk finally opened his office door, they found an unsettling scene. The room was pristine, almost too pristine, as if it had been wiped clean of any sign of activity. The large oak desk sat in its usual place, but on top of it lay a strange clue, a half-written letter addressed to someone named E. The ink had smudged, as though the writer had been interrupted mid-thought. Even stranger, Marcus Hardman's chair was slightly askew, and on the polished floor beneath it, a single key glinted in the sunlight streaming through the window. The key was small, nondescript, and entirely unfamiliar to anyone in the office. No one knew what it opened or why it was there. Then there was the smell of faint but unmistakable scent of something sweet and floral, lingering in the air like a ghost. It wasn't Hardman's cologne, and no one could place it. The last sighting of Marcus was just as baffling. A local shopkeeper swore he saw Hardman walking toward the woods on the outskirts of town late the previous evening, his head low and his hands in his pockets. But why would a man of his stature venture into the woods alone, and at such an odd hour? As whispers of his disappearance spread through Market Basing, the list of suspects began to take shape. The loyal secretary. Miss Abigail Trelawney had worked for Hardman for years and was fiercely loyal, or so she claimed, but her nervous stammer and shifting eyes during questioning told a different story. What was she hiding? And why did she hesitate every time she mentioned the letter? The business rival. James Crowther, a man with ambition as sharp as his tongue. He and Hardman had clashed publicly more than once over a lucrative contract. Crowther had motive, no doubt, but did he have the opportunity? The quiet maid, Mary Fenton, a timid young woman who worked at Hardman's estate. She claimed she hadn't seen him since dinner the night before his disappearance, but her pale face and trembling hands suggested otherwise. What did she know, and what was she so afraid of? As Poirot questioned each of them, he observed the web of lies they spun. It wasn't the obvious inconsistencies that interested him, it was the subtle truths hiding beneath. Everyone hides something, Hastings, Poirot remarked with a knowing smile, but the question is, what is worth hiding, and what is worth killing for? Just as they thought the investigation had hit a dead end, a startling discovery threw everything into chaos. A second key, identical to the one found in Hardman's office, was unearthed in a place no one expected inside the pocket of Mary Fenton's apron. But why did she have it? And more importantly, what did the key unlock? As Poirot examined the second key, a shadow crossed the room, a silent figure standing just out of sight, watching their every move. Hastings turned, but the figure was gone before he could catch a glimpse. Monday, Sir Hastings, Poirot said quietly, his eyes narrowing. I believe we are not the only ones searching for the truth, and I fear they may find it first. Poirot's first suspect was the ever-loyal secretary, Abigail Trelawney. She sat across from him in the drawing room, wringing her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her gaze darted around the room, never once meeting Poirot's sharp, unrelenting eyes. You were the last to see Monsieur Hardman in his office, n'est ce pas? Poirot asked, his voice smooth yet pointed. Yes, that's right, Abigail stammered, her words tumbling out in a flurry. He was in a hurry, seemed distracted, said he had something important to handle. She paused, biting her lip nervously, and then he left. Poirot leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers. And what was this something important? I don't know, she said quickly, but her voice wavered, betraying her. Hastings, watching from the corner, muttered, A loyal secretary should know, shouldn't she? Poirot ignored him, instead noting the trembling in Abigail's hands. Miss Trelawney, I believe you know more than you are saying. And let me tell you, silence can be as dangerous as a lie. Abigail opened her mouth as if to speak, but instead she burst into tears. Poirot simply smiled to himself. A key piece of the puzzle, Hastings, he said later. She knows something, but it is not guilt that silences hair, it is fear. The next stop was James Crowther, Hardman's business rival. The man oozed confidence, lounging in his leather armchair with a cigar perched between his fingers. Look, detective, Crowther said with a smirk, Hardman and I didn't always see eye to eye, but that doesn't mean I had anything to do with his disappearance. You had motive, Hastings said, cutting in. A man in your position might do anything to win a contract. Crowther chuckled, taking a long drag from his cigar. Do you really think I'd risk everything over one deal? Please, Hardman's gone because he got tangled in something bigger than either of us. I'd bet my fortune on it. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Bigger than the two of you? How intriguing. And yet, Monsieur Crowther, I do not believe you have told me the entire truth. Tell me what was the nature of your last conversation with Monsieur Hardman. Crowther's face darkened, the smirk vanishing. He stubbed out his cigar with unnecessary force. I told you, I don't know where he is. That's all I've got for you. As Poirot and Hastings left, Hastings whispered, He's hiding something. Did you see the way he clammed up? Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Ah, mon ami, people do not clam up unless they fear what might slip out. It is not what he says that interests might, is what he refuses to say. Finally, they turned their attention to Mary Fenton, the quiet maid. She was pale and trembling as she stood in the kitchen, clutching a dishcloth like it was a lifeline. I told you, sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't see Mr. Hardman after dinner. I don't know anything. Mais non, Poirot said kindly, his tone softening. You do know something, Miss Fenton, something that frightens you, but keeping it to yourself will not make it go away. It will only grow larger in your mind. Tears welled up in Mary's eyes. I heard voices, she admitted finally. Late at night, Mr. Hardman was arguing with someone in the study. I didn't see who it was, but it sounded bad. Angry. And what else? Poirot pressed gently. Mary hesitated, then looked around as though someone might be listening. I found a glove, she whispered. A man's glove, near the back door, but when I went to fetch it later, it was gone. As Poirot left the estate, Hastings couldn't contain his frustration. Well, they're all hiding something, but none of them gives us a complete picture. What now? Poirot stopped, his gaze fixed on the ground as though seeing something invisible. Ah, Hastings, he said softly. It is not the lies that interest me, but the truth they are hiding beneath. And that truth, I suspect, is far more dangerous than we imagined. At that moment, a loud crash shattered the quiet of the estate. They turned to see a shadow dart across the window of Hardman's study. Someone was inside, someone who clearly didn't want them to uncover the truth. Hurry, Hastings, Poirot said, his voice calm but urgent. The game is afoot, and we are not the only players. The small study at Marcus Hardman's home was quiet too quiet. Poirot stood by the desk, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Hastings lingered behind him, shuffling his feet impatiently. Poirot, we've been over this place a dozen times, Hastings said, exasperated. What are you expecting to find? Hardman is gone, vanished into thin air. Poirot held up a finger, silencing Hastings. Ah, mon ami, he said, his voice low. It is the things that are not here that interest me the most. Observe. Poirot's gaze fell upon the bookshelf, where a thick layer of dust lay undisturbed except for one curious gap. He carefully pulled a book from the adjacent row and inspected the faint impression left behind. A ledger, he murmured, recently removed. Someone does not want us to see what it contains. At that moment, the faint sound of rustling paper caught his attention. Poirot tilted his head, his senses on high alert. Do you hear that, Hastings? He whispered. They crept toward the window, where shadows danced against the moonlit garden. Through the half-drawn curtains, they spotted a figure near a fire pit, hurriedly feeding papers into the flames. Poirot's sharp eyes caught a glint of something ring on the figure's hand. A woman, he noted softly, and not one of the household staff. Fascinating. Before Hastings could react, the figure dashed away into the darkness, leaving only embers in her wake. Poirot wasted no time, retrieving the half-burned remnants from the fire. He laid them out carefully on the desk. This, Poirot said, holding up a charred scrap of paper, is most interesting. Written in bold, unmistakable handwriting were the words transfer of assets. Assets? What does that mean? Hastings asked, leaning in. Poirot's expression grew darker. It means, my friend, that Monsieur Hardman may not have vanished at all. He may have staged his disappearance for financial gain. Or perhaps, Poirot hesitated, his voice dropping to a grave whisper, to protect himself from something or someone. But before they could delve further, a commotion erupted from downstairs. A maid's shrill scream pierced the air, followed by the sound of glass shattering. They rushed down to find chaos in the drawing room. A locked display cabinet had been smashed open, its contents a collection of rare coins scattered across the floor. The butler stood frozen, pointing toward the open door. I saw him, sir. A man. He broke in and went straight for the cabinet. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. And what did he take? The butler stammered. Not the coins, sir. just an envelope tucked inside. Poirot's face turned ashen. An envelope? Describe it. It was plain, sir, but Mr. Hardman always said it contained something irreplaceable. As Poirot knelt to inspect the broken glass, Hastings muttered, "This is madness. First Hardman disappears, now someone's tampering with evidence and stealing what sounds like nothing more than a scrap of paper." Poirot straightened, his expression unreadable. "Oh, Hastings," he said softly, "a scrap of paper can hold the weight of the world. And now, I fear we are not dealing with one culprit but several. The question is, are they working together or against each other?" Just then, a shadow moved outside the doorway. Poirot snapped his head toward it, but the figure vanished before he could see more. He turned to Hastings, his tone low and urgent. "Monday, Amy. We are being watched." Hastings froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the cane he carried. "You mean—" "Yes," Poirot cut him off. "Someone does not want us to uncover the truth, and they will stop at nothing to ensure we do not." Outside, a faint plume of smoke rose into the night sky, blending with the mist, as if erasing all traces of what had just occurred. Poirot turned back to Hastings, his voice now a whisper. "And yet, Hastings, it is not the end game that intrigues me. It is the question, who is pulling the strings?" The scene fades with a lingering shot of the burned papers on Poirot's desk, one word barely legible: betrayal. The grand drawing room of Marcus Hardman's manor was packed with tension. Every seat was filled, though none of the occupants seemed comfortable. The once pristine chandeliers cast long, uneasy shadows as the evening deepened. Hercule Poirot stood at the center, his hands clasped behind his back, surveying the room like a general preparing for battle. Beside him, Hastings shifted nervously, glancing at the suspects. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice calm yet razor-sharp, "we are gathered here because the disappearance of Monsieur Marcus Hardman is no mere coincidence. It is a web of lies, deceit, and carefully guarded secrets. But as you know, no web is impenetrable enough to Hercule Poirot." The room tensed as Poirot began pacing slowly, his eyes landing on each suspect in turn. "Let us begin with Miss Evelyn Craddock, the loyal secretary." Poirot gestured toward the trembling woman who clutched her handkerchief tightly. "Mademoiselle, your nervousness betrays you. You claim to know nothing of Monsieur Hardman's affairs. Yet I found this." He held up a torn scrap of paper, a piece of a letter, addressed to a solicitor. Evelyn gasped. I don't know what you're talking about. That's not mine." "Ah, but you forget, mademoiselle. I saw your handwriting in the office ledger. This letter matches perfectly. You were arranging for Monsieur Hardman's assets to be transferred quietly and without his knowledge. Why?" Poirot's voice turned sharp, his gaze piercing. Evelyn broke under the pressure. "He forced me to, I swear. He said if I didn't, I'd lose my position. But I didn't know what he was planning. I had nothing to do with his disappearance." Poirot let the confession hang in the air, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on the next suspect. "And now we come to Mr. Lionel Brooks, the business rival." Poirot's tone grew cold. "You had everything to gain from Hardman's absence, did you not? Your failing investments, your recent legal troubles. Monsieur Brooks, you were seen near the manor the night before his disappearance." Brooks stood, his face pale. "That's preposterous. I only came to discuss a deal with Hardman refused to meet me during the day." "A deal?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And yet you brought no documents, no proposals, nothing. Curious, no? Perhaps you were here for something far less professional." Brooks fell silent, beads of sweat forming on his brow. Poirot turned toward the maid, young Mary Clark, who sat hunched in her chair, her eyes darting around the room. "And finally, we have you, mademoiselle," Poirot said softly, his voice almost kind. "You were the last person to see Monsieur Hardman, were you not? You brought him his tea that morning." Mary stammered. I don't know anything. I just do what I'm told." Poirot leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Ah, but you saw something, did you not? Something that frightened you." Mary burst into tears. I saw a man leaving his study, but I didn't recognize him. I swear I didn't." Poirot straightened, his face grave. "A man? Or perhaps a woman dressed as a man?" The room fell into stunned silence. "Indeed, there is more to this disappearance than meets the eye," Poirot continued. "The half-burned papers, the stolen envelope, the staged burglary, all these pieces form a picture of a carefully orchestrated plan. But there is one piece missing." Poirot turned sharply toward the door, his voice ringing out. "And that piece is the return of Marcus Hardman himself." The door creaked open, and the shadow of a figure appeared, stepping into the room. Gasps erupted from the group as the man's face came into view. Hastings's jaw dropped. Good heavens, it is Hardman. But Poirot's face was grim. Or is it? He murmured. The figure stopped in the doorway, his face half lit by the flickering chandelier. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he smiled. Bravo, Monsieur Poirot, the man said, his voice smooth and calculated. But do you really know who I am? The scene cuts to black, leaving the audience on the edge of their seats, desperate to know the truth. The room fell into a heavy silence as Marcus Hardman, or the man claiming to be him, stood at the doorway. Poirot's piercing gaze never wavered. The figure smirked, but there was unease in his eyes. Marcus Hardman, Poirot began, his tone measured. You disappeared, leaving chaos in your wake. But the truth, as always, is far more intricate. You did not vanish out of fear or desperation, no. It was a plan, a scheme you meticulously crafted. Gasps rippled through the group. Evelyn Craddock looked as though she might faint, while Lionel Brooks leaned forward, his knuckles white on the armrest. Poirot began pacing, his voice rising with every revelation. You were drowning in financial ruin, Monsieur deals gone sour, debts piling up, and a reputation hanging by a thread. But rather than face your creditors, you chose a more dramatic solution. You staged your disappearance intending to vanish and start anew under a different identity. A classic ruse. Hardman's smirk faltered. That's absurd. Silence. Poirot's command cut through the air. Do not insult my intelligence, monsieur. The half-written letter in your office was a goodbye disguised as an unfinished task. The missing key? Your means of slipping away unnoticed. And the peculiar scent in the air? Eau de Cologne slingering from the moment you fled through the side door, leaving the rest of the town to assume the worst. Hardman's shoulders sagged, but Poirot wasn't finished. But what you did not anticipate, monsieur, was that your scheme was not as hidden as you believed. Someone in this very town uncovered your plan. The room collectively inhaled. Poirot's eyes swept over the suspects like a hawk. This person saw an opportunity to ensure that your grand escape would never succeed. And more than that, they had their own reasons for wanting you gone. Permanently. Poirot turned abruptly toward Evelyn Craddock. You, mademoiselle, knew of his disappearance before it happened. You arranged for his assets to be transferred to a private account overseas. Yet, you did not act alone, did you? Evelyn shook her head, tears brimming. I only did what he asked. I didn't know what would happen. Poirot's voice softened slightly. Non, you did not. You were a pawn in his game. But the real culprit, the one who ensured Monsieur Hardman's disappearance, was permanent had their own motives. The room tensed as Poirot slowly turned to Lionel Brooks. Ah, monsieur, a business rival, a man pushed to the brink by financial ruin. You discovered his scheme, did you not? You saw his escape as a chance to settle your vendettas, to silence him and protect your own interests. And when you found out where he would be hiding, you acted. Brooks rose to his feet, his face pale. I didn't kill him, I swear. Poirot raised a hand. Ah, but you would have, had he not returned tonight. What you fail to anticipate, monsieur, is that the web of deceit in this town does not belong to one man. It is woven by many. Poirot's voice grew grave as he faced the room. This case is not just about Marcus Hardman. It is about a town that hides its secrets too well. A town where blackmail thrives, where debts are traded like currency, and where silence is paid for in blood. The weight of his words lingered. The townsfolk in the room exchanged uneasy glances. Poirot straightened, his gaze unrelenting. The truth, mes amis, is that Marcus Hardman's plan was not unique. He is but a symptom of a greater diseased network of deceit that has festered in market basing for years, and tonight that network begins to unravel. As Poirot's words settled over the room, the chandelier flickered ominously. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of church bells rang, as if tolling for the secrets of the town. And then Poirot turned to Hastings with a faint smile. Come on, there is still much to uncover. The night is far from over. The screen fades to black, leaving the audience breathless, desperate to know just how deep market basing's secrets truly run. Emotional climax and resolution. As the suspects departed one by one, their faces etched with guilt, relief, or quiet resignation, the grand room in Hardman's mansion fell eerily silent. Only Poirot and Hastings remained, seated by the roaring fire. Hastings, ever curious and slightly perplexed, glanced at his friend. That was quite the performance, Poirot. Hastings began, his voice breaking the stillness. But I must say, I'm still baffled by some of it. Hardman's scheme, the lies of the suspects, the scandal. It's all so tangled. How do you make sense of it all? Poirot gave a small, knowing smile, the light from the fire dancing in his eyes. Ah, mon ami, it is simple if one understands human nature. People are never as simple as they appear. They wear masks to protect themselves, to shield their desires, their fears, even from themselves. Hastings frowned, and yet you always seem to uncover what's beneath. Poirot leaned back in his chair, folding his hands neatly. It is because I look where others do not. I listen to what is not said. Behind every lie is a truth struggling to be heard, and behind every truth is a story often, a story they are too afraid to tell. The fire crackled, filling the room with a brief moment of warmth and calm. But Poirot's gaze turned somber. You see, Hastings, market basing is not unique. Every town, every place hides its shadows. It is not the cobblestone streets or the grand houses that define it as the people. People who love, who betray, who fear, and who hope. And in their humanity, they create stories as intricate as any mystery. Hastings sat quietly, absorbing Poirot's words, before asking softly, "But what now? Will the town move on after all this?" Poirot's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. Non, mon ami. The cobblestones of Market Basing will remain silent, but they will never forget the truth buried in their shadows. This night, the town has been unmasked. Scars will remain, secrets will linger, and some questions will never have answers. Hastings shifted in his chair, his curiosity sparked. What do you mean by unanswered questions, Poirot? Surely you've uncovered everything. Poirot's eyes gleamed with a hint of mischief. Perhaps, Hastings, or perhaps there are things even I cannot know. For instance, who was it that sent the anonymous note that led me to this case in the first place? Was it a friend or an enemy? And what if Hardman's scheme did we truly uncover every player in this game? Hastings blinked, startled. You mean to say? Poirot interrupted gently, his voice soft but firm. Life, mon ami, is full of mysteries, not all of which are meant to be solved. Sometimes the most intriguing question is the one that remains unanswered. The fire dimmed as Poirot rose gracefully from his chair, his silhouette sharp against the flickering embers. He adjusted his perfectly tailored coat and glanced back at Hastings with a small smile. Come, Hastings, the night is over, but our journey is not, and who knows? Perhaps the shadows of Market Basing have more secrets yet to reveal. As the two men stepped out into the cool night, the camera panned back to the empty room, where the fire slowly extinguished itself, leaving only darkness. And then, just as the scene fades, a faint rustling sound is heard like the turning of a page, or the scrape of a chair. A shadow flickers briefly across the room. The screen cuts to black, with the haunting question, was it truly over?